you take, say, the Met Police's Pan-London Hate Crime Scrutiny Panel, which kinds of groups are represented on there? So you have Muslims, you have black people, you have Caribbean people, you have Eastern Europeans, you have Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, we have Jews as well, of course. And you have every single group basically other than white men and Christians, or white people and Christians. And the only reference I can find to it is an article in The Guardian in 2005 after an FOI, which found that actually about half of the murders in the previous 10 years were against whites.
If this person has said that they have been victimised, and you say, can I have some evidence for that, please, before I kick somebody's door down and give them a scarlet letter which prevents them from getting a job, if you say that, you yourself are, subjected them to white ways of knowing.
We're shouting and chanting white racist scum at him, and they kicked him in the head, and the judge said later that he could easily have died because they left him face down in a ditch. And the judge himself said he was probably attacked because he was white, and yet somehow with all the anti-racism industry, with all the sensitivity we have to this was never deemed to be a hate crime, so the CPS didn't prosecute it as a hate crime, and he got just 34 months. You know, you can define English ethnicity as the people that no one cares about hate crimes about.
Welcome back to Deprogram. This is the New Culture Forum show where we do our best to fight back against the forces of ideological conformity, especially among the young. I'm Harrison Pitt, contributing editor at the European Conservative, a fellow at the New Culture Forum, and I'm thrilled to be joined today, as ever, by Connor Tomlinson, one of the leading contributors at Courage Media, and our special guest this week, Laurie Wastell, associate editor at the Daily Sceptic and the host of the Sceptic podcast. Laurie, welcome.
Thank you, Harrison. Good to be here.
One of the buzzwords at the moment is two-tier. A very recent brazen example occurred when the Sentencing Council, I think it was, one of the many Quangos in this country that has far too much power, said that effectively in the name of social justice they would be giving white men harsher prison sentences, or advising governments, or advising, we should probably say, magistrates to give white men harsher prison sentences, despite the fact that they are actually have a lower propensity than many ethnic minorities to commit crime. Before we get into what this is symptomatic of, in terms of systematic discrimination against white men in Britain, which I don't think is an overstatement, given the current situation, are you satisfied that this particular episode is over and that the Labour government has effectively climbed down from, because Shabima Mahmood, the Attorney General, was quite keen to distance herself from this. Do you think that she's convincingly done that, or do you think that there's more to this than...
There's a lot more to it, really, because there's a lot of institutional processes behind this. And so, you say it's a climb down. Really, it wasn't particularly her in a very deliberate way, the Lord Chancellor, who climbed up in the first place. It was more that she didn't really notice, and Robert Jenrick, the shadow Lord Chancellor, has obviously done very well in bringing attention to this, but she hadn't really noticed that this two-tier guidance, as you spoke about, was coming down the pipeline. And so, to be clear, it will likely, you're right, have the effect of making, in general, white men and Christians, and basically white Christian men, as Robert Jenrick put it, likely or less likely to not go to prison. Mm-hmm. So a pre-sentence report doesn't necessarily mean you don't go to prison, but in particular, what this is mandating is a full pre-sentence report, which is, so there's a cursory one which takes about half an hour, there's a slightly longer one which takes about a week, and there's a full one which is, I think, so this is basically having a series of interviews with a probation officer about kind of what your life is like and things of what the impact of a sentence would be, but also, why you did it and things like this. And so naturally, the effect of a pre-sentencing report will always be, not always be, but if you're having one group having them mandatorily and the other one not, then that is likely to change the sentencing outcome. And in fact, we know this. So the Sentencing Council has been very dishonest on this, really. So they've written back to Shabima Mahmood, which we'll get into the sort of constitutional aspect of it in a second. But they've written back to her and said, well, actually, the PSRs, they don't mandate any sentences, and therefore there's nothing to see here. But this is complete nonsense, because even in that very same email or letter, they admit that the reason that they're doing this in the first place is to, quote, address disparities.
Indeed.
And at the same time, though, of course, Harrison, they admit that they're not certain, I think that's what they say, why these disparities are there. So there's no necessary reason to think that this is due to discrimination or this is due to some unfair treatment. But nevertheless, they want to sort of introduce this technocratic wheeze to affect the outcomes. And this is, of course, starts with a report by David Lammy in 2017, which takes a very really Ibram Kendi style approach to disparities, basically assuming that where there is a disparity in sentencing, then that is necessarily a problem, which isn't necessarily a problem. So there's that in the one case, but of course another aspect to this is the whole institutional thing.
And we will get to that, but you're right, there's a sense in which they're proposing a quack cure before they've even had the due diligence to engage in a kind of diagnosis. Before we get to what Connor has to say about this, is it not the case that Shabima Mahmood might not have her own personal fingerprints on it, but didn't she have one of her representatives or someone from her office attending these meetings? Is that not the case?
No, that's absolutely right. And so, yes, they performed, either way you look at it, they did badly. Either they, she was happy for this to go on, which is bad, or she basically didn't notice that it was happening. And neither of those reflects very well on her. Nevertheless, she did immediately come out when it was raised by Robert Jenrick and say, this is a bad thing, this is two-tier justice, which she's right to do. But this is now where you get to the constitutional question of who is actually in charge here, because, so we'll probably get into this more later, but this is the Sentencing Council. It's a Quango that operates, that was brought into existence in 2009 and 10. And, it's kind of overstepping its remit here, but it has kind of gone ahead and done this. And Shabima Mahmood has said, let's not have this, and sort of tried to slap them down. But so far, they're digging their heels in. So the letter that came back was very dismissive of the very idea that she would have oversight over this. Yeah. It's sort of, she had said, as well she might, as well Robert Jenrick did, as well the public will view it quite rightly as two-tier justice. And they said, I don't really know why you consider this important. And so what happens here is this is a Quango taking a political decision that people will be outraged about, but they basically don't care. And a large part of the letter was them just saying, we went through the bureaucratic process correctly. And so why are you annoyed about this? Because in any case, ministers don't usually question our decisions, so just back down, really. And so there's this amazing entitlement and I suppose the final thing on the nature of this. So it's both a Quango, but it's a Quango of lawyers who are high and mighty. So there's sort of these two elements of the stakeholder state that I think we're going to get into at one there. And so it really sets up a constitutional clash that so far there's no evidence that Shabana Mahmood is going to win, because currently this guidance is still set to come in on the 1st of April. Now, potentially by the time this goes out, something will have changed there and they would have backed down. But so far they're saying, no, basically we're going to defy you and bring it in anyway.
Hello, please excuse this brief interruption, but I'd be really grateful if you could please hit the subscribe button and subscribe to our channel. Our mission is vitally important, and we must grow this channel to ensure that our content reaches the biggest possible audience. The best way to do this is for you to subscribe. It's totally free. And in addition to subscribing, if you're able to donate or join our membership scheme, please click on the link in the description or visit our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. We've got great plans ahead, but we can't do it without your support. From only £4 per month, you'll receive a range of perks and benefits, including exclusive content. Thank you.
I do like the Pontius Pilate hand-washing of, well, how does this affect you personally, do they say, as you're being hauled off in cuffs while... I mean, who could have predicted men in dresses might commit an exponentially more amount of sex crime per capita? Never ceases to amaze. But what you're getting at here is basically the state is on rails. Like the Quangos set the government agenda, and even if the government ostensibly want to challenge it, they themselves can't feel they can really do anything. Otherwise, they're in breach of the ministerial code and they're interfering with the impartial, ostensibly impartial, civil service process. I mean, I know Robert Jenrick did something which is both principled and quite politically clever in saying at the dispatch box, here's a bill. If you commit to signing this bill with the opposition, this will shoot this down instantly, or you can allow the process to play out, and in the interim time where this guidance is done away with, after it passes, there will still be criminals of all stripes except straight white Christian men who are let off with a slap on the wrist, whereas, for intersectional reasons, they're put in prison. And so in that interim time, injustice is still done. Shabana Mahmood refused to support it, presumably because she would be going against the ostensibly neutral institution of this quanga that was put in place as well by the Conservative government. So do ministers actually have sovereignty over this, or is the guidance set by the civil service sovereign over Parliament?
Well, the fact is she does have sovereignty over it, but the question is whether she wants to actually exercise it properly. I mean, partly, yes, as you say, Robert Jenner has been very clever about this, and she should really, if she's putting her money where her mouth is, just take him up on this bill. But obviously she doesn't want to do that. So far, we'll actually see what happens by the time this goes out, really. But she's going to be having a crunch meeting with the Sentencing Council, and maybe she'll be able to whip them into shape. But yes, if she really wanted to exercise her prerogative, she could bring this bill in rapidly and change things. But so far, she's threatened to bring it in a different bill. I forget the name, but that will take a lot longer. But I mean, that is a key thing, Connor, is that, there is one of the excuses that the Sentencing Council made was, as I mentioned earlier, is they basically said, well, ministers don't usually kind of oversee us in this way. And that's right, but that's just because no one has really bothered to before. But she could do this, and, she could do Robert Jenrick's bill, for instance. And this is to go like a long way back to the architects of this whole kind of stakeholder society that we have now. One of the comments that they were eager to make was that, or to really illustrate what they were going to do, was to say, we're going to create a constitutional revolution such that no one can unmake it even after we've left power. So this is all the way back in about 1998. And that's sort of true if you don't have the will to unmake it. But in fact, Parliament remains sovereign. Shabana Mahmood is indeed the minister in charge of this and could do something about it if she wants to. And this is the question Labour find themselves in more broadly on this topic now with, so today, we're recording this, Keir Starmer has gone after NHS England, for instance, and now whether how significant that is, it remains to be seen. But still, there's even an impetus within Labour, this present iteration of Labour, to go after the blob broadly. And that does reflect the fact that even though there's been this great, unweeded garden that's grown to seed of the Constitution, it could be uprooted by someone with sufficient will.
I would argue that a major problem as well is that as a result of precisely the sorts of changes, constitutional changes, the quangocracy, not stakeholder capitalism, stakeholder society, everything, all the rest of it, a kind of political inertia sets in, and remaining loyal to that inertia, remaining inert, is equated with the rule of law. So all of a sudden, if you're not inert, if through an act of will, you don't rely on the kind of sleepwalking quangocracy, but say, no, we're going to cut this bill off at the knees. We're going to prevent this. We're going to get rid of the Migration Advisory Committee. We're going to get rid of this. We're going to get rid of that. All of a sudden, given that people have become accustomed, or not people, but given that people in this neck of the woods in Westminster have become accustomed to that form of zombified government that exists without will, any act of will begins to look like fascism to them.
Yes, but you can just do things, So you can do things, yes. And this abolition of NHS England is actually quite significant in that really no one saw it coming. I mean, it's partly Wes Streeting's thing, but it shows that they can. But sorry, what was the question?
Oh no, I'm just making a point that people. The very idea that you can just do things begins to look fascistic to a political elite that has equated the kind of political inertia that accommodates these constitutional changes, equates that with the rule of law, or you're going against the rule of law.
Yesterday's revolutionaries suddenly become Burkeans and defending the institutions that they themselves have laid down.
Exactly.
But I'm worried though. So with the contortion of NHS England and the sort of
just before we go on, one thing that's very noticeable about Starmer as well made a similar comment about getting out of the tepid bath of managed decline. That was in December. And this was very swiftly denounced as Trumpist or Trumpian. And in the same way, Robert Jenrick's intervention about the Sentencing Council and later Shabana Mahmood was denounced with precisely the same language. So, as you say, this is equated with some sort of fascistic thing that is seen as extremely threatening to the current present powers that be.
They're dropping a toaster and said bath instead. I'm wondering if this refashioning of NHS England and putting it back into the NHS more broadly is pushing at the blob from one end, but rather than making a dent in it, it's just, the blob moves out the other side with the same level. It continues to be the same size. And I say this, a perfect example of this, Wes Streeting perhaps being a cunning political actor eyeing up Starmer's shoulder blades to plunge the knife in, is to refashion himself as a moderate. After he cemented Victoria Atkins' ban on puberty blockers into law after the High Court decision, he's now also allowed the NHS to launch a clinical trial of said puberty blockers with thousands of pounds over how many years, with the eye to return the medical experimentation on children. So much like you're pushing the blob, but your handprint comes out the other side. I'm wondering if even if they do win this battle in the Sentencing Council, the anti-white ideology that has infected the civil service and the civil service powers to run this through without much opposition still remains.
Absolutely. I mean, we should be careful not to sing Labour's praises too much here. I mean, yes, these are sort of headline-grabbing moves, and it would be nice if they did take on the Sentencing Council effectively. But even in this, they were essentially bounced into doing it by Robert Jenrick, and I think probably Shabana Mahmood might regret having come out so strongly. I mean, like a sort of normal person who's accountable to the electorate, this is why she did it. But in the comments when Robert Jenrick made his point about it, she didn't know what he was talking about, firstly, but she did come out and say, well, we will never have two-tier justice under my watch, which sounded like it was something she believed in. And so it was almost as if she accidentally stumbled across a principle there that then later she had to go and enforce by taking on the blob. And now she's got this mountain to climb. Most people in her party will, or maybe she will have some cover for it with what Starmer's currently doing. But it's one thing to denounce, the overreach of the blob, as of course the Tories did for very many years, or some of them did. But it's quite another to fully take it on and reorient, the whole state, which is, as you say, is full of anti-white ideology and much else besides.
I want to relish stories like this because it helps make it easier for us to make our case that because it's so clear-cut, it's such a brazen example of an anti-white two-tier society in action. But one of the reasons why I'm often a bit skeptical about jumping on them too much is because often these are just the tips of the iceberg. They're indicative of deeper institutional trends, and you understand this. And you're, I believe, working on a piece at the moment. By the time this goes out, you may well have published it, I'm guessing with the Daily Sceptic, on how a lot of this, in institutional terms, a lot of this ideology and a lot of the kind of legalism around it has its roots in the 1998, let me just get this right, it's the
Crime and Disorder Act.
That's right,
I'd say maybe not the ideology, but certainly that has had a tremendous effect as basically, so what that does is create hate crimes, which didn't exist before.
This is in 98.
In 98.
Yeah.
And it wasn't... A judge could take into account racial aggravation before, but it wasn't specifically in the law. Now, of course, under the letter of the law of hate crimes, they're not two-tier because they could technically apply to everyone, and everyone has a protected characteristic, including us. But it's quite a long story about why they're sort of applied in one way and not another.
Just make it clear to me what exactly the change is.
So the change is...
Before we talk about how it's applied.
It brings in the concept of a hate crime. So it brings in a racially aggravated offence and significantly stiffer penalties for those. So, for instance, common assault could be 6 months, and racially aggravated common assault, I think, could be 2 years.
Yes.
Or something like that. And even for murder, the minimum term is normally, I think this is right, normally 15 years, and for racially aggravated, it could be 30.
Yeah.
And so there's, the idea is to sort of show that society particularly dislikes racism and racial hate crimes, which obviously it does. But the thing is that the way this is conceived at the time and continues to be conceived, both just generally in ideological terms, but also more importantly, in terms of the institution, which I'll tell you about in a second, is that hate crimes only in one direction. It's committed by white people against non-white people, basically, and there's sort of disability and a few other categories.
People, Muslims.
Yes. Yeah, there's religion as well, yeah. The thing is that it was a new concept, and the question was who was going to report it and how much was it going to be reported. And of course, this is all coming. It's quite a long story, but it is, I think, worth going into. This is all coming in at the time. The Stephen Lawrence murder is in, I think, 1993, and shortly after that, there's the Macpherson report. And the key. Well, there's two, I suppose, key innovations that brings in. One of them is the idea of institutional racism, which massively affects, in particular, the police, but also the body politic more widely, with this idea that we've got a sort of atone for our sins, but of course it's an unfalsifiable idea.
We need to cleanse ourselves through the active pursuit of social justice.
Yes.
Equality before the law is all of a sudden suspicious because it might be shielding certain disparities rather than correcting them, and therefore you need active correction, not just passive rule of law. That's the rough idea. Active correction, and you need to sort of demonstrate you're committed to this, and that's something that the police feel that they have to do, so they sort of have to atone and demonstrate their credentials to to kind of victim groups. And so what you have set up within not long of this act are these things called hate crime scrutiny panels. And this sort of goes also into the stakeholder stuff of, the state is kind of including extra people in its processes as opposed to just having the state and the individual. There's this other group which is purporting to speak for, black people, Asian people, whatever it is. And so, the conclusion I'm building to will not surprise you here, but if you take, say, the Met Police's Pan-London Hate Crime Scrutiny Panel, which kinds of groups are represented on there? So you have Muslims, you have black people, you have Caribbean people, you have Eastern Europeans, you have Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, you have Jews as well, of course. And you have every single group basically other than white men and Christians, or white people and Christians. And so this is no small thing, because basically the way that these scrutiny panels work is they are a opportunity for these community groups to basically ask the police to pay special attention to them and to demonstrate that by how many hate crimes they're finding and prosecuting. And so if you have, and there are other institutional things involved. I mean, if you look at it, scratch any general anti-racism charity or look into how it describes hate crime or anything else, and you can see that the framing is always, about it being against ethnic minorities. This is basically how the idea has always been conceived. And so basically you have this situation where hate crimes are only applied in one direction, and it's necessarily therefore two-tier. Because how could it not be if there's no institutional backing? And indeed, it's even taboo to notice hate crimes against white people. For instance, there's a report in The Guardian in about 2005, which I was looking up racially motivated murders and whether that's talked about or not. And the only reference I can find to it is an article in The Guardian in 2005 after an FOI, which found that actually about half of the murders in the previous 10 years were against whites. And then there was this outcry about that statistic, and it was, it's very taboo, we can't talk about it. But the point being, there's all kinds of reasons why this law, which looks neutral, absolutely is not applied in a neutral way. And therefore, to come back to, I haven't really given examples of it, but if we talk, for instance, about Southport, or if we talk about grooming
people, gangs. Or the grooming gangs, exactly. So on the one hand, you have any kind of even relatively minor racially aggravated offence can be taken extremely seriously. But on the other hand, you mentioned the grooming gangs, exactly. Never have they ever been treated as racially aggravated when they very obviously were. And that is one of the big outrages that, of our time, really.
You also mentioned Stephen Lawrence in the Macpherson report, the accusation of the police being sort of irredeemably institutionally racist, despite, I think it was Civitas report a couple of years later coming out and criticising them for not having any evidence as to institutional racism on the part of police officers, that the investigation wouldn't have been handled if the suspect was white, that the police were in strange struggle sessions.
I mean, it was incompetence. It wasn't...
Yeah, they were forced to confess to private racist thoughts and those of their colleagues as if they could read their minds. Despite that, it's become like Britain's George Floyd. It's become a kind of founding anti-racist mythology for the 21st century. And one of the things that Daily Sceptic and the Free Speech Union, obviously both under Toby Young's umbrella, have been very good on is non-crime hate incidents. What I think a lot of people don't understand is that that was put in place by another Quango put in place by the Conservative government, like the Sentencing Council, which is the College of Policing. Thanks for that, Theresa May. Brilliant. And they then put in place the 2014 Hate Crime Operational Guidance based on the Macpherson report, which then introduced non-crime hate incidents so that the police could record offensive microaggressions by members of the public against members of the public to prove their anti-racist bona fides because they had already been accused of institutional racism. So do you have much information on what the non-crime hate incidents are like these days, considering Suella Braverman tried to make an intervention, much like Shabana Mahmood is promising to do so, and that intervention seems to have only made it worse?
The NCHIs, there's been attempts to curtail them, but they don't seem to be able to get them to go away, really. I think and that was, yes, as you say, Suella Braverman. But the other thing is that so both NCHIs and, I should have mentioned earlier, and hate crimes themselves are subject to what the College of Policing calls something like perception-based reporting.
Which also grows out of the Macpherson report.
Yes, absolutely. And that's, to translate, it means if you think it's a hate crime, then we have to report it. And so this is what always comes through in official statistics. And so it's like reported hate crimes. Okay, so is that a crime or is it not? We don't know. But the numbers of these are hundreds and hundreds of thousands now but partly because to go back to the scrutiny panels, there was sort of this like circular situation where they had to kind of create activist groups whose job it is to go and look for hate crimes and then report lots of them. And then the police can say, oh, look, we're doing a wonderful job. We're going after all these hate crimes. And so, yeah, it's just this self-fulfilling cycle of, well, there probably are some, but these statistics of 100,000 this year, 100,000, less last year, or whatever it is, are really not worth very much. But it is a way of saying, of sort of keeping the moral fervor about this going and saying, oh, look how racist we are, but also look how anti-racist the police are. So
it's racism inflation. It reminds me of Tell Mama, the statistic where they said, after Boris Johnson published his Telegraph columns calling Muslim women letterboxes and bank robbers, we saw a 400% increase in anti-Muslim hate incidents. And what that meant is 4 women called up a telephone line without any police follow-up or investigation saying, yeah, someone was a bit rude to me about my headscarf. I got a bit upset that day. And then they just drew correlation and causation. And then the police themselves, or these hate crime scrutiny bodies, are discouraged from engaging in secondary victimization. Translation, if this person has said that they have been victimized and you say, can I have some evidence for that, please, before I kick somebody's door down and give them a scarlet letter which prevents them from getting a job, if you say that, you yourself are, subjected them to white ways of knowing by saying that, can we have some proof for that, please? So you cannot ask for scrutiny. They are a victim by virtue of calling themselves a victim. So to turn that into a question, do we sort this out without just throwing out the founding mythology and just saying, well, Macpherson is illegitimate?
Yes, I think there has to be a massive reevaluation of that. I know Ed West has written quite well on that recently. There was also a book on the Macpherson report, and I think, as you were talking about, it was basically a struggle session, and there was very little evidence was ever brought that even in the original, that they had mishandled it, but it didn't show that they were racist. And one of the things that was brought to suggest that they were racist was that I forget the precise details, but there were very flimsy ways of saying this. But yeah, I mean, I think that would suggest that the entire concept and really equalities industry that's grown out of the Stephen Lawrence report, or the Macpherson report rather, should be questioned. But I mean, so you mentioned that the lack of evidence that is needed for hate crime on the one hand, it could just be, someone looked at me funny or whatever it was. But on the other hand, this is coming back to the two-tier aspect of it, in cases where it's absolutely overwhelmingly clear that something was racially motivated, we can get into the grooming gangs in a second, this is often ignored. So there's an example last year. I mean, two-tier justice manifests itself in various ways. One of them is that it's what the media pays attention to. Now, so after there was unrest out of Southport last summer, and this included, disgraceful scenes trying to burn down asylum hotels, fine, that had an enormous amount of attention. What had very little attention was that there were sectarian Muslim mobs in places in the north of England which formed and in some cases attacked people. Now, one case that really stood out to me when I found out about it, just because I was searching through things, because there's been so little attention to it, was a man by the name of Amir Khalil, I believe, and it was a mob in Middlesbrough that he was a part of that were running down the street chasing basically a random white passerby. And they said to him, they were shouting and chanting white racist scum at him, and they kicked him in the head. And the judge said later that he could easily have died because they left him face down in a ditch. And the judge himself said he was probably attacked because he was white. And yet, somehow, I've hit the mic there, somehow with all the anti-racism industry, with all the sensitivity we have to this was never deemed to be a hate crime. So the CPS didn't prosecute it as a hate crime. And he got just 34 months for that. And so, yes, there are many other examples. But if you have this massive institutional weight on the one hand saying we've got to look for even the tiniest of microaggressions, on the other hand, you have this clear and blatant racial attack being ignored, it's no wonder that people think there's two-tier justice.
What are the standards of precision like when it comes to actually trying to land a racial aggravation conviction? I accept in advance that what I'm about to say isn't necessarily cast iron proof, that I'm right to be skeptical about them being very good. But I mean, just think of the unrest of 2020, Derek Chauvin and George Floyd, quite apart from whether you think that Chauvin actually committed murder, whether you think it was something more like manslaughter, or whether you think that George Floyd actually died of a mixture of hysteria and a drug overdose. These are all very plausible, by the way, and I don't think that trial was at all legitimate, even if the outcome was correct, which I question. But forget that for a moment. No one ever actually tried to make the case that Derek Chauvin was racist against George Floyd, and yet it became a sort of lightning rod for that sort of thinking, and we reevaluated our whole institutional fabric in Britain, across the Atlantic, on the basis of someone dying, potentially murder, potentially the result of manslaughter, potentially drug overdose in Minneapolis. And yet no one has ever tried to prove that Derek Chauvin, even if he did deliberately do harm to George Floyd, was racially motivated in doing so. What kind of standards of precision are employed, even by the CPS, in trying to land these kind of racially aggravated convictions? I'll give you two cases in particular that you have mentioned in an excellent thread you've done on this, which I'm sure is probably the nucleus of an article in the works. Bob Stewart and Derek Hagee?
Derek Hagee, and
go on.
So Bob Stewart, I mean, this one is particularly ridiculous. So I don't really know what the controversy was, but he's a Tory MP, and he was involved in some controversy with the Bahraini government. And there was a Bahraini activist who heckled him in the street, was being quite obnoxious towards him. And he said to this activist, after exchanging a few words, "Oh, go back to Bahrain." And in fact, he added, "Bahrain's a nice place." And that was it. And this aggrieved activist who was saying he was taking money from the government or something, some random squabble, he ended up getting prosecuted as a racially aggravated public order offence. And now, admittedly, eventually it did get quashed, which is a good thing. But he had the whole chilling effect of it, and. So,
the CPS even entertained that, while at the same time, as you point out in your thread, I'm only plagiarizing you here. The rape gangs, probably the most disgusting instance of racial hatred in post-war British history, perhaps in the entirety of British history. I don't think the CPS has ever tried to intensify the punishments that would be applied to that on the basis that there was clear evidence of racial aggravation.
Yes.
And yet here, when it sounds like just a contentious exchange of views, and by the way, if he cares about Bahrain so much, maybe he should be back in Bahrain. Arrest me. Says that, all of a sudden, public order offence, CPS goes into overdrive. It's absurd.
I'm just trying to get my quote, which has just disappeared, but to be honest, I don't really need it. So you mentioned the lack of evidence that was needed to say that Derek Chauvin had, committed a racist murder. It probably wasn't even a murder, but in any case, it was sufficient that it was a white police officer and a black man, and that was it.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. And so across the decades of the rape gang scandal, that has been it. If we took that standard, then you wouldn't even have needed any careful evidence collection by the CPS or by the police rather, to show that they had said, while they were raping them, said the things that they did indeed say, like white slag and much worse. It would have been taken as prima facie racially aggravated, which, but of course, on the other hand, there's a great effort. Well, so the CPS kind of ignored it, and other people would say, "Oh no, it's about class, or it's about it happens across communities, and sort of it could happen to anyone, and race did not play a key role in it," which is obviously not true. But never, even despite all of that, despite the fact that it's kind of ignored and there's this omerta on it, I'm just going to find the quote.
Well, what you do, I mean, it's absurd that it wasn't prosecuted as racially aggravated, because I think there's a 2017 trial of a Rochdale rape gang leader who launched into a tirade during his trial where he said, Pakistanis are the supreme race, all of you white bastards will go to hell, etc. So, I mean, he wasn't muted about his opinions on white people, and yet that wasn't even prosecuted as a racially aggravated hate crime, as far as I understand it.
Yes. Oh, one of the things I found when I was researching this is there's a paper by a sort of left-leaning criminologist in about 2013.
A left-leaning criminologist?
I know. Yes. But arguing, nevertheless, the Rochdale rape gang, so this is 9 men who were prosecuted in 2012, should have been prosecuted as racially aggravated. And which is fair enough, but it's quite strange because he sort of gets into this very contorted explanation for why maybe the police didn't quite understand that they could be seen as victims or as someone to be victimized rather. And anyway, there's kind of this whole. There's an inability to look at that in a straightforward way and say, well, yeah, that's clearly what's happening. So in that trial, that's the point. The judge said, you clearly attacked them because they were not of your community. And one of the people he was sentencing, had said literally in the trial, this is a different trial, but they kind of come out with it very straightforwardly, that he said, he didn't want to be seen in the town with white girls. And so this was clear to the judge, and yet again, it was not prosecuted as racially aggravated, and some of the people in that gang got off with 4 years, one with 5.
Yes,
which is just obscenely low.
We have people in prison. We have sort of otherwise exemplary citizens in prison for intemperate, rage rhetoric on Facebook at exactly the same time. I suppose a final question to consider, Laurie, is. This raises a conundrum in practical policy terms. Let's say that we have the kind of patriotic government that we need and would want tomorrow with a stable majority that could get things done. Given the way in which our institutions are presently constituted, even though in theory the hate crime law needn't be two-tier, because so long as every single stakeholder, every single group is treated in a neutral and impartial way, we would get grooming gang leaders getting much bigger sentences in theory on this. Should we be trying to fill institutions with stakeholders who will stick up for the host population and to that extent perpetuating stakeholder politics, or should we just be washing our hands of the whole kind of hate crime architecture altogether?
It's a very, very good question, and I'm a little bit torn about it. I mean, I think one of the funny things is that obviously we've had this debate recently over, is there English identity or is there English ethnicity? And, you can define English ethnicity as the people that no one cares about hate crimes about, essentially. And they don't have a group to speak for them on the hate crime panels or anything else.
Have you tried that on Fraser Nelson?
I have been
working.
I think I did tweet.
It might finally get blocked.
It might finally get you that much in the block.
So part of the unwitting actions of, obviously, in doing this in the first place, there is a great, one of the reasons that anti-white hate crime is never paid attention to is because it's supposed to birth the great devil of white identity politics, which seems to be the worst thing ever. But of course, really, in having the contradictions of this two-tier system increasingly obviously expose themselves, this is actually what the authorities are currently creating.
Indeed.
And so, yes, it's really unwise to that extent, I think. I think ideally there wouldn't need to be a sort of an extra white group of the hate crime scrutiny panel, because ideally you would have, well, firstly, one of the things that I often have to make clear that I'm arguing, because I'm often writing about free speech cases and where someone like Lucy Connolly, for instance, who was one of the Southwark rioters, well, no, not rioters, who
Posters on Facebook.
Put something on Facebook and went to prison for a very long time. And then you might compare that with someone who said something anti-white or whatever it was, and
so it happens all the time.
And wouldn't go to prison. But what I'm arguing there is that neither of them should go to prison.
Yes.
And because there's this absolute obsession with race and with speech as well, which we shouldn't have. And so another element to the two-tier issue is that certain kind of speech crimes and like political seeming crimes are deemed taken extremely seriously, whereas actual violence isn't. And so there's been a suggestion by Yvette Cooper to bring in, make gang grooming itself an aggravated offence. Maybe, but I think we really should just have stiffer penalties in general, because we've kind of had this strange situation where we blur the distinction between violence and unsafe or racist speech.
Yes.
And actually, if we just prosecuted physical crimes much more robustly and left the speech to it, that would be, that would do a lot to mend the current state of the two-tier system.
Laurie Wastell, it's been very informative. Thank you very much for joining Connor and me on Deprogram.
Thank you, Harrison.
Connor, thank you. As ever, you've been watching Deprogram. Make sure to like, subscribe, do leave a comment if you'd like to, and we shall see you on the next one.
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture, and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programs, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.